So glad to have you along once again. We are joined as always by Greg Engert, beer director for the Neighborhood Restaurant Group, which includes such places as Evening Star Cafe and Planet Wine in the Delray neighborhood. Greg, a James Beard Award nominee. What's on tap this week?
So this week I decided to not serve an imperial stout. I use bourbon barrels for the 100 plus degree weather we're going through, but rather something that is perfect for the summertime, and it's Gueuze from Tilquin in Belgium. So Gueuze is this crazy word on the bottle here. This is an invention actually of the late 19th century in Belgium, in and around Brussels, and it is a blend of 1-, 2-, and 3-year-old lambics. Lambic is the now famous spontaneously fermented, funky, oak-aged wild beer that's tart, has a rusticity to it, that's been being enjoyed in and around Brussels for hundreds and hundreds of years. At the end of the 19th century, bottled beer became big, and carbonated bottled beer became big. So lambic, for the longest time, was, fermented with airborne yeasts and bacteria that were positive, that would just come into the beer and start fermenting it. They would let it age in oak barrels where fermentation would continue, and then typically they would just serve it out of oak barrels, and it would be flat because it would lose its carbon dioxide over time that's created during fermentation. Well, at the end of the 19th century, people were looking for bottled beers. Bottles were now available due to the Industrial Revolution, and they also were looking for carbonation now. And so in order to get this still flat, funky lambic to be carbonated, they took a page out of the champagne producer's handbook and blended it. So when you take 1-year-old lambic, this still has lots of fermentable sugars. The 2-year-old has a little bit. The 3-year-old's almost completely dry, but it's got lots of hungry wild yeast still waiting around. So by blending, you can spark a natural re-fermentation that occurs in the bottle and gives you a wonderful brilliance and cool effervescence. And that's why we have a cork and caged on here as well, because this is all living natural. It's not filtered, it's not pasteurized, and it is going to continue to re-ferment in the bottle. So if pressure builds up, this helps out a little bit with that. Blending has become quite an art, because when this first started happening, you had the brewers at the end of the 19th century brewing these lambics spontaneously fermented, and they would sell it to pubs or negociants who would blend and bottle for them. So blenders were kind of detached already. Now a lot of breweries started doing their own blending, of course, but you still had some blenders. The wars in Europe hurt the brewing industries all around, but particularly the Belgians, because copper was always stolen from munitions. So in the case of like Hanson's, they were producing just regular ales before the war, and then the Germans came in and stole their coppers, and afterwards they didn't have the ability to brew anymore, so they decided to start blending lambic, and that's why Hansen still is just a blender. Fast forward to early 90s, and there were only 3 blenders left in Belgium. Nowadays, people go crazy for Gueuze and lambic, but it was dying out. There were 3, Hansen's, Drie Fonteinen, and Moreau closed shortly thereafter, so there were only 2. But now today, I believe there are actually 5. Drie Fonteinen, Hansen's, we have Oude Gueuze, which used to brew, now they're just blending. De Cam, which started in 1997, and then Pierre Tilquin started blending just a few years ago in 2009, 2010. So this is the newest blender around, kind of the most modern of the Gueuze blenders, and a fantastic bottling.
Shouldn't we really take Beer of the Week on the road to Belgium
Yeah,
sometime?
we actually should, I think.
Maybe my bosses can see fit to pitching in for that. Well, what's great about this is you can smell it already from 18 inches away.
Yeah, it's big, and
it's effervescent smelling.
For people who aren't familiar with this style, it's obviously going to be fairly expensive. I mean, it is not something that is readily available.
I think the guy in the dump truck out there needs one.
Yeah,
you can hear him. Sorry to interrupt.
This is the beautiful thing about doing this on location.
Maybe you didn't hear it.
The funny thing with these beers, it's hard. They're naturally scarce. It's all barrel aged. You have to let the beer develop and then you blend. So it's going to be scarce. It's going to be pricey. But you just get complexities of flavors that you wouldn't expect. And by virtue of the positive bacteria that get into the beer, you get a little bit of acidity. But then Brettanomyces is a semi-wild yeast strain that's airborne all around us that is going to convert sugars into alcohol, carbon dioxide, not a lot of acidity, but a funky rustic quality. So when you smell this, that's why you get that kind of earthy, farmy, leathery note. That's all created through Brettanomyces, which is a wonderful airborne wild yeast. But also now it's been cultivated and grown. So you can order Brett, craft brewers just add Brett to their beers as well.
That's delicious. Now, I was telling you that I recently had at home a couple bottles of New Belgium's Lips of Faith Tart Lychee.
Yeah.
And which is delicious, and it's similar. They're different, but they're both this and that and this style very refreshing.
Yeah.
And we've talked about this before too. Sometimes it's different. If the first time you have it, you're sort of like, wow, is that beer? But yes, it is.
It is,
and it's really good.
It's amazing, and that is the thing. I mean, for what most people don't realize, beer's been being brewed for 6, 8, 10,000 years. It had a funky rusticity and a little bit of tartness to it for 99.9% of beer's history. The cleaned up, kind of crisp, refreshing flavors most people associate with beer is very, very recent invention. So there was a thirst for refreshing acidity and funk in beers for a long time, and thankfully that's come back now, and so many brewers are making so many great renditions of them. I mean, phenomenal.
We talked last week about how difficult it is, and we've talked before that too, of pairing super hoppy beers. This is not super hoppy. What would you pair this with?
So one of the cool things, when I started thinking about beer and food, there weren't a lot of treatises or there wasn't a ton of information on how to do it. Garrett Oliver's masterpiece, The Brewmaster's Table, is one thing that really got me started, and I studied that, and I still do. It's an amazing book. But I ended up really studying wine and sommeliers who were talking about wine and food pairing and seeing where I could apply it. And one of the most obvious ways were in wine-like beers, tart and funky vinous beers, like Lambic, like Gueuze, like Berliner Weiss, or sour wild ales in general. And because of the acidity that these beers share with wine. And so one of the best things about acid is that it kind of mellows salt, and salt mellows acid. So things that are really briny and salty with a tart, refreshing beer, or wine for that matter, are just perfect together. So, this is why it's not strange that so much Gueuze is consumed with mussels in and around Brussels when there's in season, of course. Oysters, clams, basically this kind of a beer at a clam bake is just going to be killer. It's going to go with everything.
And good for a hot summery day. Refreshing.
Totally, just refreshing. And that's the other thing. This beer is huge on flavor. I mean, literally, it is spontaneously fermented. Nobody's adding any yeast to this beer. Happens all naturally. It's aged in oak barrels. It picks up tannic qualities. It's then blended, but it doesn't really get that high in alcohol because spontaneous fermentation is kind of uncontrolled. So they're typically around 5%. So they are session beers. You can drink lots of them in the sun. Which is, for beers with this much character, it's really crazy that they're only 5% alcohol as well.
How great is it that beer magic is just floating around in the air all around us?
It's amazing. It's everywhere all the time.
To our Ask Greg segment for this time out, Earl Holman writes, and this is going to be open-ended and probably take longer than we normally have time for. What is your favorite beer of all time? He's curious to know.
That is a question that I've probably been asked more than any other in my life at this point, and it's impossible to say. Of course, I can't. That'd be really hard. It's a whimsy thing. It depends on the day of the week, the time of the day. Go through phases. I probably have 100 beers that I think are just amazing. That if I could have at any given time, I would have them, and so. I can't answer that.
Maybe we could give Earl a beer that you recall from years back that maybe he hasn't had that really blew your mind when you were first starting getting into beer.
Yeah. So that one's a little easier. One of the beers that really got me going on beer in general was actually one that's kind of funky too, and it's called Orval. It is one of the monastic beers from the Trappist in Belgium. It's pretty readily available, which is cool. It comes in a cool kind of high-shouldered bottle, and it is a beer that is loosely based on the Saison style. So pale in color, dry, mildly hoppy. I've heard people say that it used to be hoppier. Great kind of fruit and spice quality in the nose. That beer, when they bottle it, they actually add in Brettanomyces, the semi-wild yeast. And so young Orval is not too funky, but as it gets going, like 6 months in, it hits its peak, in my opinion. 6 to 9 months, it dries it out because it's still fermenting. It's got a funky rusticity to it, and it's just incredibly complex. It looks like an unfiltered Pilsner and is just really just wild in character. And that was one of the ones that I realized, not just that beer could be so different than the more ubiquitous pale lager, but also that beer had history. It's what led me to start thinking about all the ways that beer had transformed over time. So.
All right, thanks for the question, Earl. If you want to be cool like Earl and ask Greg a question, the email address is beeroftheweek@WTOP.com. Greg, thank you as always.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Cool.
Everyone, be sure to always drink responsibly, and please do join us next time. Bring your thirst for another Beer of the Week.